I think we're probably closer to the ethos of a film like Beginners or 20th Century Woman or Lady Bird rather than like Fablemans.
I was going to say, this is not your Fablemans.
It's not Fablemans.
Sean, congrats on Dìdi. I saw this film last week in Los Angeles. It is such a special film. It is so sweet and soulful and nostalgic, and you can just tell it was made with so much love. I could go on and on, but I'm gonna start interviewing you now. What a year you've been having. I mean, we're only like 2.5 months in, and maybe is this the best year ever? I mean, okay, let's just recap. Let's just recap like January. You're at Sundance with Dìdi, and you get nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Short. Has this year been a whirlwind for you?
Yeah, we premiered the movie on a Friday, got nominated for an Oscar on a Tuesday. The next Friday, we won the Audience Award, special jury prize for ensemble cast. I think Saturday, Focus bought the movie.
Right, that happened too.
And then
yes.
I think Sunday, I was like back in LA, just in my room, like, what just happened?
Amazing. I think the lion's share of your work has been in the documentary realm, and you've done some shorts. This is, I believe, your narrative feature film debut. What was the process of bringing this to the screen?
It was long, but it wasn't like, I think people say, you hear people and filmmakers say like, oh, this film took 7 years, a decade long to make or something, and I think we kind of fall in that category. But it wasn't like I was only working on this for the last 7 years. I started probably writing this in 2017 around, and so it was just always kind of chipping away at the script, thinking, oh, hopefully someone will let me make this one day. And it was personal, and I wrote it in a way where I was like, okay, I think it's small enough, it's set in my hometown, we can kind of bring the community into it. But it was, and even just looking back now in retrospect, a lot of the shorts kind of came from what I was trying to explore in the feature too. I think a lot of my shorts also explore themes of belonging and identity and friendship and adolescence as well. And so everything I've done in like the last 7 years kind of feels all like they swirl together, even though this is a narrative feature and a lot of the shorts, like you said, are doc shorts. To me, they all kind of feel like they're cut from the same cloth. And so I think they've informed one another. So
Dìdi follows a 13-year-old Taiwanese American boy named Chris Wang, who's struggling with early teendom. He's struggling with how to connect with his friends and be a cooler kid. The typical the American struggle so many teenagers go through, how to talk to girls. Like, how autobiographical was this story? Was this ripped from your own experience as a teen?
I think people will watch it and think it is, but and it is semi-autobiographical with like the broad strokes of it are obviously. I was 13 in 2008. I come from a Taiwanese American, background. Both my parents are immigrants from Taiwan. I have an older sister. It's the same age gap. But ultimately, I wasn't interested in making a memoir. I would if we look at the canon of personal storytelling in film, I think we're probably closer to the ethos of a film like Beginners or 20th Century Woman or Lady Bird rather than like Fablemans.
I was gonna say, this is not your Fablemans.
It's not Fablemans, and it was really just kind of being inspired by movies like that, movies like Lady Bird or 400 Blows or Ratcatcher, movies that you could tell were so personal and lived in and vivid, like the details and the texture were all there, but ultimately they're telling a story. I think that's what I was interested in. Like the world that I grew up in, that sort of hub of Fremont, California in the Bay Area, and like the specificity of like me and my friends, and like watching a movie like Stand By Me and being like, oh, I relate to that movie, but it's not my life. And realizing like, oh, the world I know, all those textures, all of those details, I haven't seen that in the movies that I love. I think there's something to mine there. But ultimately it wasn't just like, I wasn't interested in just like splattering memories on screen. Like ultimately, like I was interested in telling a story. And I think it was going back to process. It was a bit twofold. It was like, okay, well, here's all these memories. Here's all these details that I think like are so lived in, are so vivid. That's great. That all feels so personal. How do we then change that, modify that, adjust that? How do we combine characters? Like, what is the story that we're telling? And ultimately, I think our story is about, like you said, a 13-year-old boy, but also how he wrestles with shame and identity and belonging, in this time period of the late 2000s. And that was kind of the thing. Once we realized that's the theme of the movie, it's like the different ways that shame manifests itself in a young boy's life, a young Asian American boy's life during that time.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's societal shame, cultural shame, personal shame, then it was taking all of the things that like were, you know, autobiographical and just seeing what we could do to modify all of that to serve the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing that's really admirable about the film and the story is sort of how imperfect Chris is. I mean, he's
a brat. He sucks.
He doesn't suck. I mean, he makes a lot of mistakes, right? Like he's, you know, whether it's like, you know, telling sort of white lie after white lie or being sort of nasty to his sister or his mom. He's imperfect, as we all were as teenagers, and I think you realize watching this film that's not. We're so used to seeing like, yeah, we've seen teen struggles on film, but like this feels so authentic. There's always this sort of notion in screenwriting of like how likable your hero has to be, right? Was there ever any temptation to steer him sort of into like a more likable lane? Not that he's unlikable, but he's just imperfect, you know?
Not personally, you know. I think even going back to the ethos of this movie, like I wanted to make a movie that, you know, again, had imperfect characters. You know, I wanted to see a messy portrait of an adolescent kid, and I think a messy portrait is an honest portrait. You know, again, going back to movies like 400 Blows or Stand By Me, I think the kids in those movies they feel like real kids. They're loud and crass, and they're not perfect. They're not like always correct, but they're also complicated and vulnerable and emotional. And I think that to me is what boyhood is. That's what adolescence is. And so, you know, I think you're right. Like he is unlikable in ways, but I don't think that's at odds with him just kind of, he's unlikable because he's like figuring himself out, right, as we all are.
Yeah.
And I think to me at least there's a relatability and a charm in that he's not just like purposefully, he's trying to figure it out, and that's what makes him kind of fumble and fall and make those mistakes. And so, you know, there was never certainly got notes sometimes like, oh, what if, you know, blah blah, he got a win here and there, and it's like sometimes he does, but I do think it was always about making it more honest and truthful to the moment than it was like, you know, let's have him pet a dog so he can be likable.
Save the cat.
Yeah, save the cat.
Yeah. I also love how evocative it is in terms of nostalgic, I should say, for like technology in the mid 2000s, and the way it's executed on screen. It's so perfect. But like from his, you know, from just finding sort of like the perfect response to the girl he has a crush on and workshopping it in real time, and AIM and MySpace top 8, like, and the sort of horrors of discovering where you do or don't sit, and like your other, like, by the way, like, who came up with that? Who thought that was a good idea? MySpace top 8, like, what if Tom was a sociopath? The more I think about it.
That's the headline. Tom is a sociopath.
Yeah, but can you talk about like because I think that is something that really jumps out about the film is how you actually portray that technology. Because like typically on the screen when you're watching someone type on a computer screen, it's not very like visually pleasing. But here it's like it's artful, and it's like, and it's humorous, and it's entertaining to watch him interact online.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really proud of those screen scenes. I think it goes back to, it was two things. It was, you know, again, like once I realized, okay, this is a movie, it's about a 13-year-old boy, then it was, how do we make this more and more and more specific every step of the way? And when I was like, okay, well, if it's going to take place in the late 2000s, there was so much technology of the late 2000s that I felt like in the movies that were made during that time, they never got the technology right, because I think by the time we actually learned how to integrate our screens with our stories, the technology had completely changed. You know, by the time, you know, films like Noah came out, that short film that takes place entirely on screens, it was like we were already in this different language of technology. So it was that, and then I had worked at this team at Google for a few years called Creative Lab, and what I was doing there was, kind of learning how to tell stories on screens. A lot of their things took place on the devices we use every day, not unlike Searching, directed by Anish Chaganty, who's a good friend. We had the same education. He used to work there too. And I remember when Searching came out, I was like, oh, he just did like the best version of that movie. But I was already developing this movie, and that's kind of when the screen stuff kind of came into play, when I was like, yeah, there is a version of this movie that I haven't seen, because they never integrate technology. And kind of like what you were saying about how oftentimes I think when filmmakers cut to a screen or try to integrate technology, it never feels authentic. It never feels good. It never feels like, oh, that's the screen I know and like use in my everyday life. And so that was kind of the bet that we were taking, was I think we can look back at this era and try to integrate all the screens and the technology of that time in a way that feels like, I think, how the internet was used, which was not this like, hacker music type thing. It feels mundane and grounded and intimate, but also very high stakes. Like when you're talking to your crush, like what does it feel like to have butterflies talking to your crush, at like 10 p.m. at night, and trying to capture those feelings in a way that feels, as high stakes as it is, but really you're just sitting in your room, like quietly.
Right. Yes, the world on your shoulders, and then we got to talk, of course, about your young lead, Izaac Wang. I mean, what sort of search was it to find him? How many actors did you audition? How did you ultimately land on Izaac?
Izaac was interesting because he was one of the first actors that we saw, and he had worked with my producer Carlos Lopez Estrada on Raya and the Last Dragon a few years ago, but he was at I think he was 14 when we shot the movie, and being 14 is so different from being 10, and Raya and the Last Dragon and like is such a different movie than our movie. And so I had only seen him in those kind of roles, but the first Zoom that we had with him, I was like, oh, there's something special here, but let's just flip every stone. And so we went the street casting route, and kind of knowing that, okay, like the character needs to skate, the character needs to speak Chinese, the character needs to also be a real kid, but also he needs to carry an entire movie on his back. And so we really read with Izaac for months and months and months, but knowing that he had this sort of magic to him, and it was all over Zoom. And one of the good fortunes that I had with this movie was I got to take it to the Sundance Directors Lab, and what they do there is you really get to you get to basically bring your like actors and workshop scenes from your movie that you find challenging.
Physically or
physically?
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so I got to bring Izaac and Shirley, who plays Vivian in the movie. It was essentially the rehearsal that we never got to have on this movie. And getting to work with them there, it was just like, this is it. Yeah.
It's amazing. And then there's, we have to talk about sort of the mother-son dynamic at the heart, because it really is, I think, ultimately the heart of this film, and it's so poignant, especially given sort of the roller coaster of, we talked about the fact that he's not always great towards his mother, and she is, and what a performance by Joan Chen, by the way. I mean, she just pops off the screen. She's amazing. But can you talk about that aspect, and how you sort of captured that dynamic between mother and son?
I mean, thank you. It really went back to that idea of wanting to create an honest portrait, and I think even the mother-son, really, I think we've seen a lot of mother-daughter relationships, but I wanted to try to make something that honored the relationship that I have with my mom, and that honored the relationship that I think a lot of immigrant kids have with their parents, where it's so loaded with love, but also this sort of specific type of shame that you can't really understand at that age, which is that gap, that cultural chasm of, the immigrant experience. And wanting to kind of explore that in a way that really felt honest, but ultimately end it with kind of a warm hug. And it is a loving, tender relationship, but it is complicated. And I think wanting to kind of showcase the side of, especially Asian immigrant moms that I felt like I hadn't really seen in storytelling. These moms that were creative and artistic and sympathetic and empathetic and tender. I think the mom in our movie is very much not a tiger mom that we've often seen in portrayals of Asian mothers and how that influences their relationship as well. And so, you know, it is and that side of the movie, that was when like the movie really clicked for me, at least when I was writing it. I was like, oh, that's what this movie is. Like, it wants to be Stand By Me, but encased in like the secret heartbeat of the movie is the mother-son relationship.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it's like, oh, how do we make a movie that's like a love letter to immigrant moms, like, but hidden in this sort of, you know, movie about adolescent friendships and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has your mom seen the movie?
She has.
Yeah.
I mean, she was giving notes on like the script.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's amazing. What kind of feedback did you get on the final product from her?
The final product, like the script.
I mean the feature film. Once
the
it was
feature
done.
film. I mean, she's proud. You know, she's really proud of it, and like she didn't really give notes on the final cut.
Yeah.
But definitely like on the script, even when we were editing, she was like, send me stuff. And like, she has such a, you know, I remember like growing up, or not, but like in the last 2 years, sometimes she'll be like, oh, what are you working on? And she's like, send it to me. I want to see. I'm like, okay, but it's a rough cut. Like, don't give me any notes. And then she'll just like write a bunch of notes. She's like, this doesn't make sense. I'm just like, okay, I didn't ask for notes. But she has such an intuitive, like, soul when it comes to this stuff. Mm-hmm. And like, even if she watches something and it doesn't make sense to her because she doesn't have the sort of cultural understanding, she knows how something makes her feel. Mm-hmm. And so like, I'll send her a piece of music, for example. Like a lot of times when we're working on the music for films, I'll send her a piece of music and I just won't say anything. I'll be like, how does this make you feel? And she'll be like, it reminds me of a meadow on a sunny spring day. And I'm like, okay, so I think that's what we're going for.
Great
so
note.
I can always trust
Great
her gut.
Speaking of the music, I mentioned before we started like how much I love the soundtrack. You got Atmosphere on there. I'm a big underground hip hop fan. How did you go about curating the soundtrack for this one?
Yeah, I love the Atmosphere shout out.
Yeah.
I mean, we have I think a couple Atmosphere needle drops in there, but it really went back to both hyper specificity and the personal element. You know, I think when we were like, okay, it's going to be set in the late 2000s, I didn't want the soundtrack of our movie to be songs that were already in the movies of the late 2000s. One, because you know, it's like it's been done, and two, we probably can't afford it,
right?
You know, to have like MIA or like MGMT on our soundtrack. But ultimately, it went back to the soundtrack. You know, even before we started shooting the movie, for years and years, I had a playlist that I would just add to. Half of the movie soundtrack is like pulled from that playlist, and I'm just so lucky that we were able to get those songs. Shout out Toko Nagata, our music supervisor. But a lot of it was also curated in the sense that it didn't have to necessarily be music that came out during the year of our movie. It just had to be music that felt personal to me. You know, a lot of the songs, Atmosphere was a big artist in my life. You know, a lot of the characters also in the movie, you know, have different kinds of influences. You know, I was really influenced by like pop punk and that kind of world growing up, but I had a lot of friends who were also influenced by hip hop, like Atmosphere, Blue Scholars, like Hieroglyphics, also like from the Bay Area.
Blackalicious.
And so it was just kind of like, how do we create a soundtrack that feels like the world that we're in? And the world and the influences of the movie are so wide. It's hip hop, it's Bay Area hyphy music, it's skateboarding, it's Warped Tour music. And so it's kind of like, how do we just make how do we use music in that way to kind of reflect the world that the movie takes place in? But again, like it wasn't about the most high profile song or the most high profile artist. It was really more about like, oh, does this song mean something to me? And it could have been like a song from a really small artist that, you know, no one really knew, but if I had something that like had a beating heart underneath, it was like, oh, we should try and lean that way, like go personal instead of recognizable. And then hopefully if the movie does well, the song then becomes recognizable. Yeah, well, it's just one more aspect that makes this such a special film, let me tell you. Well, Sean, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, guys.
Guys, one more time for Sean Wang.